ethnography. With a keen interest in Portuguese literature and culture in Asia, his research in Goa was supported by the American Institute of Indian Studies and conducted at the Xavier Centre for Historical Research. Professor Jackson is an academic member of the Academia de Marinha and the Academia Portuguesa de Historia, Lisbon. He has a host of books and publications to his credit and is the recipient of the Vasco da Gama Medal, Portugal, and the Ordem de Rio Branco Medal, Brazil. Let's give him a round of applause. When he isn't writing or immersed in research or delivering keynote addresses, you'll probably find him playing the cello. As a matter of fact, Dr. Jackson has performed as a cellist in several professional orchestras and a string quartet. Let's give it up once again to Dr.
Professor Dean Anurada Bhagwan, Professor Koshi, Dean Tottenham, the steering committee, and Professor Prof Spooka, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. As chair of the Council on Latin American and Iberian Studies at Yale University, I'm honored to be at Goa University to participate in the conference, India-Portugal Confluence of Cultures. The Council at Yale University is collaborating with our South Asian Studies Council to promote studies of Goa in a broad Indian, Iberian, and South Asian context, with a focus here today on philosophy, literature, and the arts. Our aim is to further interaction and collaboration between Goan and international scholars. We wish to recognize the work of all Goan scholars, those here at Goa University and others who have dedicated themselves to Goan studies. Our theme today, India-Portugal, Confluence of Cultures, continues to place studies of Goan philosophy, literature, and arts in a broad perspective, while focusing on Goa-based writers and artists, and it recognizes the important history, which includes some distinguished figures from past centuries. Please allow me a brief historical panorama. In the 16th century, Garcia da Orta, horticulturalist, pharmacologist, and physician, came to Goa with his mentor, Martim Afonso de Souza, in the fleet of 1554, and lived out the second half of his life in Portuguese India. Quote, a pioneer of tropical medicine, in Cigar Boxer's words. Orta represents scientists whose inventory and medical study of tropical flora represented a revolution in medical knowledge, shown in his book, Colóquio dos Simples e Drogas e Causas Medicinais da Índia, one of the first books published here in 1563. From the 18th century, featured in a statue in Panjin, is José Custódio de Faria, born the same year as Mozart, who published in Paris his De la cause du sommeil lucide, the cause of lucid sleep, based on experiments of Franz Anton Mesmer. He took part in the French Revolution and was professor at the Université de France in Nîmes and a character in Pierre-Alexandre Dumas' 1844 novel, Le Comte de Monte Cristo. Looking back at our predecessors in the study of Goa in the 19th century, we recognize Joaquim Helodorio da Cunha Rivara, much esteemed at this university, whose 22 years spent in Goa produced important studies, including a translation of Thomas Stevens' Arte da Língua Canarim, and the Arquivo Português Oriental, a collection of valuable documents on Portuguese presence in Asia. Worth our attention also is the notable case of Antonio Lopes Mendes, who, after preparing the magistral volumes of A Índia Portuguesa in the 1860s, went to Brazil, where he left 95 drawings and wrote Oriente America, still a very little known work, comparing customs of people of Brazil with those of Goa. There is Gabriel de Saldanha, História de Goa from 1898, and also from the 19th century is José Gerson da Cunha's important work on the antiquities of Shaul and Bassain, and surprisingly, his book Origin of Bombay, with a long illuminating section on the Portuguese period
with information on Garcia da Orta and communities such as Ormuz and Shaul. For research on Creole Portuguese, Sebastiano Dalgado's work on Portuguese dialects and his notable Glossario Luso-Asiático remain essential references, as are Tavares de Melo's articles on the Indo-Portuguese dialect of Ceylon, found in the journal published here, O Oriente Português. With Dalgado and Tavares de Melo, the confluence began to flow back from India to Portugal. At the time of my own introduction to Goa, beginning in the 1970s, I had the good fortune to meet many active Goan scholars, publishers, essayists, and journalists. And while these names may be unfamiliar to most of you, I would like to recognize them for their historical, certainly, importance. From the Jesuit John Correa Afonso to the publisher Dr. José Rangel of the notable typography, the scholar of Goan music, Michael Martins, Father Filinto Dias, author of a forgotten history of Indo-Portuguese literature, the Esboço da História da Literatura Indo-Portuguesa of 1963. Jeremias Xavier de Carvalho, who republished historical texts and founded the Academia Oriente e Ocidente de Goa. Aleixo Costa, author of a 2-volume biography of great Goans. The great José Pereira, author of essential books on Goan architecture and music, and not neglecting the repository of all things Goan, who was Percival Noronha. What I have come to think is most remarkable about their generation was their ability to combine a remarkable repertoire of local knowledge with an international outlook, perhaps a formative and lasting characteristic of Goan society where East meets West. The notable anthropologist Robert Newman wrote that Goans have been multicultural for 1,000 years. Many notable contributions to Goan literary scholarship at that time were the work of foreign scholars, such as Henry Schulberg's Bibliography of Goa from 1982, compiled with the expert aid of Carmo Azevedo, which continues to be an essential guide to published materials. Robert Newman's recent books, titled Goan Anthropology, based on research in the 1960s to the 80s, were recently published in 2019 by Goa 1556 and Frederick Noronha. The British scholar Paul Melville Castro, whose father was Goan, has published important anthologies such as Lengthening Shadows, an anthology of Goan short stories, along with other essays and neglected works. He writes for the João Roque Literary Journal and collaborated with Brazilian scholar Elder Gomes on the Pensando Goa project, the Thinking Goa, at the University of São Paulo, Brazil. Gomes is also a member of the International Seminar on Indo-Portuguese History, formed in 1978, which met here in Goa in November. Philosopher Jonathan Ganeri, fortunately with us today, and I would like to recognize his important inspiration for the creation of this conference, has contributed 3 important books that make a connection between Indian philosophy and Portugal's most complex and essential contemporary writer, Fernando Pessoa, the latest one to be presented here shortly. We are here to study the confluence of cultures that continues to bring together India and Portugal, which is the country where Goan literature first began to receive international attention through Vimala Devi's groundbreaking anthology of Indo-Portuguese literature published in 1971. That anthology was perhaps the first important step to launch a post-revolutionary flowering of studies of Goa in Portugal, which is now drawing more international attention to Goan studies. Prominent current examples, not to mention other people here, such as Professor Rosa Maria Pérez, include Angela Barreto Xavier's book, Religion and Empire in Portuguese India, Felipe Vicente's book, Other Orientalisms, on José Gerson da Cunha, her Império da Visão, on photography in the colonial Portuguese context, on the photographers Sousa Paul, and Entre Dois Impérios, Between Two Empires, on British travelers to Goa, plus an important essay on Goan women writers from 1860 to 1940. There's also Joana Pass's book, Goan Literature in Portuguese, 19th and 20th Centuries, and as I mentioned, the works of the pioneer in Goan studies, the anthropologist with us today, Rosa Maria Pérez, editor of the Essential Stories of Goa from 1997, the Os Portugueses no Oriente, História e Itinerárias Representações, 2006, and author more recently of The Tulsi and the Cross, Anthropology and the Colonial Encounter in Goa, and other essays on Goan literature, culture, and society, including Goa Passado e Presente, Past and Present Goa, and Goa Portuguesa e Pós-Colonial, Literatura, Cultura e Sociedade, Portuguese and Post-Colonial Goa Literature, Culture, and Society. We cannot forget Susana Sardo, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, a frequent visitor to Goa and holder of the Cunha Rivara chair, and her studies of Goan music, and her book Guerras de Jasmim e Mogadim, and her project with the very interesting title of Luso-Sonia, Luso Sound, at the University of Aveiro. Yale University has played, up to today, a small role in Goan studies. The 2013 Yale Conference on Goa, a Post-Colonial Society Between Cultures, brought together Goan authors, including Anthony Gomes, Victor Rangel Ribeiro, and Margaret Mascarenhas, as well as scholars including Rochelle Pinto, Felipe Vicente, Robert Newman, Paul Melui Castro, and the journalist Ashley de Mello. I would especially like to mention again my thanks to Rochelle, who edited the proceedings, and to Frederick Noronha, who published them in the book of the same title that came out in 2018 by Goa 1556. This November, the Council at Yale again sponsored a conference on Goa, the Goa Perspectives on Culture and History, which paired historians Pedro Cardim from the New University of Lisbon and Liam Rocky, an historian from Michigan State University, with Ananya Chakravarti's local focus on language, religion, and locality, Dr. John de Figueiredo's presentation on the teaching of Ayurvedic treatments in Goa Medical College, putting together history with cultural perspectives promised to add a vital dimension to Goan studies. Professor Ananya Kabir, who subsequently came to lecture here in Goa University, presented her very interesting theory on musical creolization and linguistic creolization, while art historian Edward Cook Jr., also with us today, and Nimi Yingpuksoan presented on Goan arts and crafts and on picturing the Japan voyage and Goans in Namban screens, respectively. The event ended with Robert Newman describing his early years in Goa as an anthropologist from the 1960s. Bringing together history and culture with some unusual topics resulted in an energy that bonded that group together. With some 50 virtual visitors registered online, this small conference helped to promote Goan studies both to a university and to an international audience. I hope perhaps some of you saw it or would be interested to see it. Author Margaret Mascarenhas, who contributed her story Partition to the Yale 2013 conference, wrote that her reason for republishing her novel Skin in Goa was, quote, to highlight the nexus between literature and art and to promote Goa-based writers and artists and art photographers. In the novel's prologue, we find a portrait of such a writer, quote, in Portuguese India, where east meets west, a woman sits with her pen poised above a blank sheet of paper. She gazes at a point where the sun sets in the Arabian Sea, and it seems to her that the end is the only viable beginning. To reach the reality of Goa's multicultural and multilingual society, study of Goa is necessarily part of a wide global frame reaching far from Goa's shores, symbolized by that vanishing point in the Arabian Sea. For centuries, Goa was the administrative and ecclesiastical center of all the enclaves and territories occupied or contacted by the Portuguese voyagers from East Africa to Japan, most of them societies to which Goa can still claim some kind of affinity. In the 16th century, Goa became the focal point of an oceanic empire extending east in the voyages to Malacca, Macau, the Sunday Islands, and Japan, and west across the Indian Ocean to Mozambique and Brazil. Situated alongside an ancient oceanic world of trade, extending from Rome to China, and with a history of miscegenation and trade, Goa's demography anticipated and prefigured the global multi-ethnic world of today. The oceanic connections were aided by diaspora, one of the enduring themes in Goan society, studied in Stella Mascarenhas Key's book, colonialism, migration, and the international Catholic Goan community. In Victor Rangel Ribeira's novel, Tivolain, which I will discuss on Wednesday, the two main characters, having traveled from Goa with their families as youths, return years later from Kuala Lumpur and Kenya separately from east and west before meeting in a village in Bardez. In the West, the topic of Goan diaspora in Africa is the subject already of extensive research, such as that by Selma Carvalho, author of A Railway Runs Through It, Goans of British East Africa, The Sisterhood of Swans, and editor of The Brave New World of Goa Writing from 2018. Connections with East Asia remain less explored. In her recent lecture here, Professor Ananya Kabir illustrated global connections through music, which in the late 19th century mixed polkas, waltzes, lunduns, and batucas, thereby demonstrated through compositions such as Carlos Eugenio Ferreira's Rapsodia Ibero-Indiana, Iberian Indian Rhapsody, evidence of, quote, Goans enjoying the same social dances that were in circulation and vogue throughout the Lusophone world. As Professor Kabir showed, compositions for piano influenced by the polka and waltz were being printed at the same time in Brazil and in Goa. This year, in the East, through music, Goa and Macau explored their historical connections in the presentations in Macau, sponsored by the Orient Foundation, of singer Nadia Rebelo, guitarist Loyola Pereira, and multi-instrumentalist Franz Schubert Cotta, with a repertoire featuring fado, mando, deknis, and dulpods. The Orient Foundation's aim is to enlarge the cultural connections between Portugal and Goa to include Macau and East Timor. Further cultural connections between Goa and Macau touch on cuisine and the Patois language. Macau cuisine, presented in Graça Pacheco Jorge's magnificently illustrated book, A Cozinha de Macau na Casa do Meu Avô, Macau Cuisine in My Grandfather's House, first published in 1992, republished now in 2015, adapted recipes from India and Malacca, such as vindaloo, sadapatel, and bhanji. Macau patois, according to Daniel Barreiros, made use of, quote, ancient vernacular vocabulary and many other items originated in India and Malacca. An old cantiga from Macau, for example, which I found in the Ta Si Yang Kuo journal of turn of the 20th century, reveals the presence in Macau of Goans and their offspring. And the cantiga, 4 lines, reads this way. Noia na janela, com fula morarim, sua mãe tancareira, sua pai canarim. Young girl in the window with a jasmine flower, your mother sailed a sampan, your father is Canaries. The Lusophone world continues to be one of syncretism of languages and peoples, living, quote, between cultures in Asia from earliest times to today's globalization, is more than an alternation between one culture and another. Rather, it is a mixture of practices in a coexistence, an interdependent dialogue and synthetic discourse. One of the longest lasting connections between Goa and the world of Portuguese voyages is musical and linguistic. In my research, I collected and recorded many of the cantigas, or folk quatrains, that are sung by descendants of Portuguese from Daman to Batikloa to Malacca, Singapore, and Macau. The community in Batikloa, for example, consists of the mixed-race, quote, people in between, to use a term applied by the sociologist Michael Roberts to the Portuguese Berbers of Sri Lanka, being defined also as dark-skinned artisans living alongside Portuguese forts or settlements along the Asian littoral, communities by the sea whose descendants can still be found in limited numbers and whose situation predates the modern category of multinational and multi-ethnic minority citizens. The cantigas can be traced to the Portuguese cancioneiros, traditional songbooks, collected, for example, by scholar Leite de Vasconcelos in the early 20th century. Local themes and variants are also common, as is the presence of another contact language, the basis for a Creole, seen, for example, in the widely spread cantiga called Papagaio Verde, or the Green Parrot, one of the oldest and most widely known cantigas. This parrot flies in from afar to teach maxims, to play the rogue, to criticize or insult, to sing to a lover, to beat its wings and sing dance tunes. It may blurt out inconvenient truths that denounce its deceitful owners. Verses of Papagaio Verde performed in Creole Portuguese in communities across South and Southeast Asia attest to the universality of the folk song and the figure of the parrot as a commentator on Indo-Portuguese and Luso-Asian community life. The song is part of a shared legacy of traditional melodies and of lyrics that function as essential components of social life, festivals, ceremonies, and rituals. Lyrics of the cantigas described community culture, especially courtship and marriage, and voiced both its social concerns and its private desires. Sebastiano Dalgado commented on the spread of such folk verses throughout the Luso-Asian Creole communities by noting similarities in quatrains of the green parrot, the Papagaio Verde from Daman, and those of Malacca. And the quote from Dalgado is the following: O passarinho verde dos atuais cristãos de Malacca, parece ser uma deturpação de Papagaio Verde, forma que aparece na seguinte quadra de Daman. Or to translate, the green parrot, or passarinho verde of the current cristãos of Malacca, seems to be a deturpation of the green parrot, the Papagaio Verde, in a form found in the following quatrain from Daman, which is the following: Papagaio Verde sentar sobre later, bater asas surumba, chamar a paz solteiro. Green parrot sitting on the milk pail, beating its wings surumba, call the eligible bachelor over. And the Goan poet Nascimento Mendonça, from the late 19th century, praises the romantic nature of the cantigas in Goa with his verses: Raparigas, raparigas, mugarins cor de luar, vossas almas são cantigas que noite alta canto mar. Young girls, jasmine flowers, color of moonlight, your souls are cantigas that the sea sings late at night. Paul de Meli Castro writes in the Jean Roque Literary Journal that, quote, Goa was and is a product of manifold influences on the ground from both east and west, and a global history connected to the seaways of the Indian Ocean and beyond. Ananya Kabir brings this idea more up to date by stating, quote, Goa's past is embedded within a transoceanic history of Portuguese connections, and Goa's present is embedded within a post-colonial India where emergent technologies and increased mobility are catalyzing renewed interest in those connections. For the next 3 days, we look forward to presentations on myth and literature, philosophical dialogue, artistic expressions, history and society, linguistic connections, arts and crafts, visual discourse, diaspora, theater, and other topics of the Indo-Portuguese confluence. On behalf of Yale University, the Council of Latin American and Iberian Studies, and the South Asian Studies Council, I'm immensely grateful for the collaboration of Goa University, which has enjoyed the cooperation and goodwill of the Vice Chancellor, Senior Professor Harilal B. Menon, Dean Anuradha Vagli, the faculty of the Shimoy Gumbab School of Languages and Literatures, the School of Sanskrit, Philosophy, and Indic Studies. This conference would not have been possible without the work of the steering committee and the special dedication of Professor Dhruv Uzgaonkar. A special thanks to all of those who worked on the program and helped secure arrangements for this conference, which I would like to dedicate to the memory of author Margaret Mascarenhas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Jackson, for giving us such a fascinating, in-depth, and exhaustive overview of the cultural connections between Portuguese and Goa. I have these very vivid images of green parrots, eligible bachelors, young girls, and jasmine flowers that will stay with me for a long time. Thank you once again. Let's hear it once more for Dr. Jackson. And may I request Drew, if you're around, to please escort Dr. Jackson back to... Oh, sorry. Before we do that, Drew, please come forward. We'd like to present a memento to Dr. Jackson as a token of our appreciation.